The red trench stretched like a wound across the blasted earth, its walls slick with crimson mud that never dried. In the year of our Lord 1914, 815 years since hell had opened its maw beneath Jerusalem, the war had carved this particular scar deep into the flesh of no man's land. Steam rose from the churned soil where artillery shells had cracked open veins of sulfur and blessed water, creating a perpetual fog that tasted of copper and ash. Private Matthias Corvin pressed his face against the periscope, watching the skeletal remains of what had once been an olive grove. The trees stood like monuments to desolation, their bark blackened and split, branches reaching toward heaven in permanent supplication. Between their trunks, shadows moved with deliberate purpose, too tall and angular to be human, yet too purposeful to be mere tricks of the perpetual twilight. "Movement. Sector 7, he whispered into the speaking tube that connected his observation post to the command bunker below. The tube was carved from human femur, blessed by Chaplain Mordecai himself, its hollow interior lined with silver to prevent demonic interference. Large figure, moving south by southeast. The response crackled back through bone and blessed metal. Describe the figure, Private. Matthias adjusted the periscope's blessed lenses, their surface etched with protective prayers in Latin and Hebrew. The figure moved between the dead trees with a gait that seemed wrong, as if its legs bent at impossible angles. Its torso rose too high, crowned with what appeared to be branching antlers or thorns. Most disturbing was the cavity in its chest, a darkness so complete it seemed to devour the pale light that filtered through the perpetual smoke. Height approximately 12 feet. Matthias reported, his voice steady, despite the cold that had settled in his bones. Humanoid in shape, but wrong in proportion. Its chest bears a void, sir, a pit that moves like breathing. Static filled the tube before Chaplain Mordecai's voice emerged, thick with suspicion. The red trench has birthed many phantoms, Private. Artillery madness affects even the most faithful. Continue observation, but do not engage. Matthias kept his eye pressed to the periscope as the figure paused beneath a particularly large tree. The dead oak's trunk was scarred with what looked like bite marks, spiraling patterns that resembled scripture written in some forgotten tongue. The creature extended one impossibly long arm toward the tree's base, and Matthias watched in fascination as the earth began to churn and bubble like boiling water. Something was rising from beneath the red soil. At first, Matthias thought it might be more bones, fragments of the countless dead that had been ground into the mud of no man's land. But, as the shapes emerged, he realized they were roots, thick and black, writhing like serpents as they broke the surface. The creature's hollow chest began to pulse with a rhythm that matched Matthias's own heartbeat, and he felt a strange warmth spreading through his limbs despite the perpetual cold of the trench. "Sir," he whispered into the speaking tube, his voice hoarse. "The entity is performing some form of cultivation. The earth responds to its presence." No response came through the blessed bone. Matthias tapped the tube gently, checking for blockages, but the silence persisted. He returned his attention to the periscope just as the creature turned its head toward his position. Where a face should have been, Matthias saw only hollow sockets filled with the same absolute darkness that gaped in its chest. Yet somehow, he knew it was looking directly at him. The creature raised one elongated finger to where its lips might have been, a gesture unmistakably human in its intent. "Silence. Keep our secret." Then it melted back into the grove, leaving only the writhing roots, and the sound of something vast breathing beneath the earth. Matthias pulled away from the periscope, his hand shaking as he reached for his rifle. The weapon was a blessed piece, its stock carved from wood taken from the true cross, its barrel sanctified with holy water from the Jordan River. Yet, as he held it, the metal felt cold and foreign, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Below him, in the command bunker, voices began to stir. Boots scraped against wooden duckboards, and the familiar sounds of evening preparation echoed up through the layers of sandbags and blessed earth. Soon, the night patrol would begin their rounds, moving through the communication trenches that connected their position to the larger network of fortifications that held the line against Hell's advancing legions. But Matthias could not shake the image of those black roots writhing in the red soil, or the way the creature's hollow chest had pulsed in rhythm with his own heart. Something was growing in no man's land, something that had been planted long before the first shells fell. Something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom. As darkness settled over the Red Trench, Matthias began to understand that the war above ground was merely a distraction from the true battle being fought in the soil beneath their feet. The creature he had seen was not an invader, but a gardener, tending to seeds that had been sown in blood and watered with the tears of the faithful. And those seeds were beginning to sprout. The evening briefing took place in the command bunker, a reinforced chamber dug 15 feet below the trench floor and lined with consecrated stones taken from Solomon's temple. Blessed candles provided the only light, their flames burning an unnatural blue that cast shifting shadows across the faces of the assembled soldiers. The air was thick with incense and the perpetual dampness that plagued all underground positions in the Red Trench. Chaplain Mordecai stood before a map table, his gaunt frame draped in the black robes of the new syncretic Orthodox. The sacred symbols embroidered on his vestments seemed to writhe in the candlelight, ancient Greek and Hebrew characters that spoke of divine protection and righteous warfare. His face was pale and drawn, marked by years of ministering to soldiers who faced enemies that challenged both body and soul. "Brothers in faith," he began, his voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed the opening of Hell's gates in Jerusalem. Command has issued new orders regarding the anomalous reports from Sector 7. A reconnaissance patrol will be dispatched at dawn to investigate and map the affected area. Sergeant Tomas Vega stepped forward, his weathered face bearing the scars of a decade fighting in the endless war. The left side of his jaw had been rebuilt with blessed silver after a demonic blade had carved away the bone, leaving his speech with a distinctive metallic resonance. "Sir, with respect, the men are reporting strange dreams, visions of trees that speak in tongues, roots that grow through their bodies while they sleep. Perhaps we should request support from the trench pilgrims before venturing into unknown territory." Chaplain Mordecai's eyes narrowed, their pale blue depths reflecting the flickering candlelight. "The trench pilgrims are engaged in their own sector, Sergeant. We must rely on our faith and our training. Select 4 men for the patrol, volunteers only." Private Matthias felt compelled to speak, despite the protocol that kept junior soldiers silent during briefings. "Sir, the entity I observed appeared to be cultivating something in the soil. The roots I saw were black as pitch and moved with deliberate purpose. This may not be a simple reconnaissance mission." The chaplain's gaze fixed on Matthias with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Private Corvin, your observations are noted. However, we must investigate these phenomena rather than cower in our trenches like frightened children. Faith is our shield, and righteousness our sword. Corporal Elena Vasquez raised her hand, the motion causing her ritual scars to catch the candlelight. The intricate patterns carved into her forearms told the story of her initiation into the Orthodox mysteries, each line representing a sacred vow taken before the altar of Saint Michael the Archangel. "I volunteer for the patrol, sir. My grandmother spoke of such creatures in the old country, before the war. She called them the planted ones, servants of the root god that grows in cursed soil." Peasant superstition, Chaplain Mordecai dismissed, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested otherwise. "We deal in facts and scripture, not folk tales." Private Joseph Kellner stood next, his massive frame making the bunker seem even smaller. The man had been a stonecutter before the war, his hands skilled at carving sacred symbols into church walls and tombstones. Now those same hands wielded blessed weapons against enemies that defied both nature and God's plan. "I'll go as well, sir. Someone needs to document what we find, and I have experience with unusual stonework and structures." Sergeant Vega nodded his approval. "I'll lead the patrol personally. One more volunteer." Private Matthias found himself standing before he realized he had made the decision. "I've already seen the creature, sir. I should be there to guide the patrol to its location." Chaplain Mordecai studied each volunteer in turn, his pale eyes seeming to peer into their souls. "Very well. You will depart at first light, following the communication trench to observation post Delta 7, then proceed on foot through the affected sector. Your mission is reconnaissance and mapping only. Do not engage the entity unless directly threatened. Document everything you observe and return with your findings before nightfall." He moved to a wooden chest secured with 3 different locks, each requiring a key worn on chains around his neck. The chest itself was carved from wood taken from Noah's Ark, its surface covered with protective wards in languages that predated the Tower of Babel. Inside, nestled in beds of blessed cloth, lay 4 silver amulets, shaped like the tree of life. "These will provide some protection against spiritual corruption," he said, handing one to each volunteer. "But remember that your greatest defense is unwavering faith. Question nothing you see, doubt nothing you experience, and trust in the righteousness of your cause." As Matthias fastened the amulet around his neck, he felt a strange tingling sensation, as if the silver were alive and aware. The metal was warm against his skin, pulsing gently in rhythm with his heartbeat. Yet something about the sensation troubled him, though he could not articulate why. The briefing concluded with evening prayers, the soldiers kneeling on the cold stone floor as Chaplain Mordecai recited the litany of protection. The ancient words echoed off the bunker walls, mixing with the distant sounds of artillery fire and the perpetual dripping of condensation that plagued all underground positions. "Grant us strength to face the darkness," the chaplain intoned, "and wisdom to recognize the light," the soldiers responded in unison. "Preserve us from corruption of body and spirit, and guide our weapons against the enemies of heaven." But, as they spoke the sacred words, Matthias could not shake the feeling that something was listening, something that found their prayers amusing rather than threatening. The sensation grew stronger as the night wore on, and when he finally dozed in his bunk, he dreamed of black roots growing through his flesh, transforming his bones into wood and his blood into sap. In his dream, the transformation did not hurt. Instead, it felt like coming home. Dawn brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the Red Trench. The sky remained the color of old blood, choked with smoke from the eternal fires that burned beyond the horizon where Hell's legions maintained their own fortifications. The air tasted of sulfur and spent cordite, thick enough to coat the back of the throat and leave a metallic aftertaste that no amount of blessed water could wash away. The patrol assembled at Observation Post Delta 7, each soldier carrying minimal equipment to maintain mobility through the treacherous terrain ahead. Sergeant Vega wore his lucky rosary, carved from the bones of Saint Sebastian, while Corporal Vasquez had painted fresh ward symbols on her rifle stock using her own blood mixed with consecrated oil. Private Kellner carried his sketching materials in a waterproof case, along with measuring tools needed to document any structures they might encounter. His notebook was bound in leather, taken from a martyred saint, its pages treated with holy water to prevent demonic corruption of any records he might make. Private Matthias checked his rifle one final time, ensuring the blessing-inscribed bullets were properly seated in the magazine. Each round had been personally consecrated by Chaplain Mordecai, the lead mixed with silver dust and the powder blessed with fragments of the true cross. Yet as he shouldered his weapon, he wondered if such earthly protections would prove effective against something that seemed to exist as much in the realm of spirit as in flesh. "Remember," Sergeant Vega said, his rebuilt jaw catching the pale light, "we observe and document. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. The war has already claimed too many good soldiers to entities that cannot be killed by conventional means." They climbed out of the trench using a ladder, carved from the wood of Gethsemane's olive trees, each rung worn smooth by countless hands seeking purchase in the blessed timber. The red mud of no man's land squelched beneath their boots as they formed a loose line and began moving toward the blasted grove where Matthias had made his sighting. The landscape was a testament to the war's unholy nature. Shell craters filled with water that reflected no light, as if the liquid itself had been cursed. Twisted metal fragments jutted from the earth like the bones of some massive beast, while scattered equipment from fallen soldiers served as grim reminders of the price paid for every yard of ground. But it was the trees that drew their attention, those skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving olive grove. As they drew closer, the unnatural aspects of the vegetation became more apparent. The bark was not merely blackened by fire, but seemed to have been carved with deliberate patterns, spiraling designs that hurt the eyes to follow and made the mind feel somehow dizzy. "Jesus and Mary," Corporal Vasquez whispered, crossing herself as she stared at the nearest tree. "Look at the base, where it meets the ground." The root system was visible above the soil, black tendrils that writhed slowly even as they watched. But more disturbing were the shapes tangled among the roots, pale objects that looked disturbingly like human bones. Yet as they moved closer, the true horror became apparent. The bones were still connected to bodies buried in the red earth. Men in the remnants of various uniforms, some bearing the colors of the new syncretic Orthodox, others wearing the badges of the Hebrew Knights or the tattered robes of trench pilgrims. All were buried up to their waists in the churned soil, their upper bodies perfectly preserved but their faces frozen in expressions of transcendent ecstasy. "They're still breathing," Private Kellner observed, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Look at their chests. They're rising and falling." Indeed, the buried soldiers showed signs of life, though their eyes remained closed and their mouths hung open as if caught in the middle of some sacred hymn. The black roots wound through their exposed flesh, entering through their mouths and emerging from their ears, creating a network that connected each figure to the trees above. Sergeant Vega approached the nearest figure, a young man wearing the insignia of a Hebrew knight. The buried soldier's lips moved slightly, forming words too soft to hear. The sergeant leaned closer, trying to make out the whispered speech. "He's reciting scripture," Vega reported, his metallic voice carrying a note of confusion. "But it's backwards, every word reversed, every verse inverted." Private Matthias felt his amulet growing warm against his chest as he surveyed the grove. There had to be at least 20 buried soldiers, all connected by the network of black roots, all whispering their reversed prayers in perfect unison. The sight was both beautiful and horrifying, like a grotesque parody of some sacred choir. "We need to document this," Corporal Vasquez said, though her voice suggested she wanted nothing more than to flee. "Command needs to know what's happening here." Private Kellner was already sketching, his trained hands capturing the essential details of the scene with quick, precise strokes. But as he worked, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. "Sergeant, look at the soil around the buried men. It's different." The red mud that had given the trench its name was indeed different near the planted soldiers. Instead of the uniform crimson that covered the rest of no man's land, the earth here showed patches of rich, dark loam, healthy soil that seemed to pulse with its own inner life. "It's spreading," Matthias observed, pointing to the edges of the grove where the red mud was gradually darkening. "Whatever process is at work here, it's transforming the very ground beneath our feet." Sergeant Vega made the decision that would doom them all. "We need samples. Kellner, collect some of that dark soil for analysis. Vasquez, check the perimeter for additional anomalies. Corvin, you're with me. We're going to examine the central tree." The largest oak stood at the heart of the grove, its massive trunk scarred with patterns that definitely resembled written text. As they approached, Matthias could see that the markings were not carved, but seemed to have grown from within the wood itself, as if the tree were bleeding words in some unknown language. The hollow in its chest was more pronounced here, a cavity large enough for a man to crawl inside. From within the darkness came the sound of breathing, slow and rhythmic, accompanied by what might have been a heartbeat amplified to inhuman proportions. "My God," Sergeant Vega breathed, reaching out to touch the scarred bark. "It's warm. The whole tree is warm, like living flesh." The moment his fingertips made contact with the trunk, every buried soldier in the grove opened their eyes in perfect unison. Their gaze was not focused on the patrol, but turned upward toward a sky they could no longer see, and from their throats came a sound that was part hymn, part scream, part birth cry. The black roots beneath their feet began to writhe with increased vigor, and Matthias felt the ground growing soft beneath his boots. The red mud was becoming something else, something hungry and alive, and it was beginning to pull at his legs with gentle but insistent pressure. "Run," he whispered, but the word came out backwards, and he realized with growing horror that his mouth was no longer entirely under his own control. The grove had awakened, and it was ready to add 4 more voices to its choir. Private Kellner's scream cut through the unnatural hymn emanating from the buried soldiers, a sound of pure terror that seemed to energize the black roots writhing beneath their feet. He had been collecting soil samples when the ground suddenly liquefied around his legs, the red mud transforming into something with the consistency of wet concrete, but the hunger of a living thing. "Help me," he gasped, reaching toward his companions as the earth swallowed him to his knees. "Something's pulling me down." Sergeant Vega lunged forward, grabbing Kellner's outstretched hand, but the moment their skin made contact, both men went rigid. Their eyes rolled back in their heads, showing only white, and their mouths opened in silent screams that gradually transformed into the same backward scripture being chanted by the planted soldiers. Corporal Vasquez raised her rifle, though what she intended to shoot remained unclear. The blessed bullets might harm the mysterious entity Matthias had observed, but they would do nothing against the corrupted earth itself. As she sighted down the barrel, black tendrils erupted from the ground around her feet, moving with serpentine grace as they wound around her ankles. "The amulets," she shouted, grasping the silver pendant at her throat. "They're supposed to protect us." But even as she spoke, Matthias could see that his own amulet was changing. The silver was darkening, tarnishing in patterns that matched the script carved into the trees. The metal that had felt warm and protective was now burning against his skin, searing the outline of the tree of life directly into his flesh. The buried soldiers continued their reverse chanting, their voices growing stronger as more members of the patrol became trapped in the hungry earth. Matthias could understand fragments of what they were saying now, twisted versions of familiar prayers that spoke of salvation through root and branch, of holy communion with the soil itself. Not salvation, he realized aloud, his voice barely audible over the growing chorus. Plantation. They're being planted like seeds. The central oak's hollow chest began to pulse more rapidly, and from within its depths came a sound like rushing wind mixed with flowing water. Something was emerging from the darkness, something that had been waiting patiently for new additions to its garden. Sergeant Vega and Private Kellner were waist-deep now, their hands clawing uselessly at the surface as the transformed mud continued its relentless consumption. But their faces showed no fear, only a growing expression of rapture, as if they were experiencing some form of divine revelation rather than being buried alive. Corporal Vasquez fired her rifle at the central tree, the blessed bullets striking the scarred bark with a sound like bells tolling. But instead of penetrating the wood, the projectile was absorbed, disappearing into the trunk as if it had never existed. The tree shuddered with what might have been pleasure, and the network of roots beneath the grove pulsed with increased activity. The ammunition feeds it. Matthias understood with dawning horror. The blessed silver, the holy water, the consecrated metal. It's not just consuming our bodies, it's feeding on our faith itself. His own legs were trapped now, held fast by earth that felt uncomfortably warm and alive. He could feel root tendrils probing at his flesh, seeking entry points, preparing to transform him into another member of the grove's unholy congregation. But unlike his companions, Matthias found himself filled not with rapture, but with a cold, analytical clarity. The entity that ruled this place was ancient, far older than the war that raged above ground. It had existed here long before Hell's Gates opened in Jerusalem, long before the First Crusade brought holy warriors to these lands. It was something primordial, something that predated human concepts of good and evil, right and wrong. And it was patient, infinitely, terrifyingly patient. The figure Matthias had observed through his periscope emerged from the central oak's hollow chest, unfolding like a flower blooming in reverse. Up close, it was even more disturbing than he had imagined. Its limbs were indeed like roots, gnarled and twisted, covered in bark-like skin that wept a dark sap. Its head was crowned not with antlers but with branches, each one bearing leaves that rustled despite the absence of any wind. Where its face should have been was only smooth wood, save for the hollow eye sockets that seemed to contain entire universes of darkness. When it spoke, the voice came not from any visible mouth but from the cavity in its chest, a sound like wind through autumn leaves mixed with the whispers of the dying. "Welcome, faithful ones." It said each word perfectly enunciated despite the lack of lips or tongue. "You have traveled far to reach this sacred grove, drawn by purposes you do not yet understand." Corporal Vasquez tried to reload her rifle, her hands shaking as she fumbled with blessed ammunition that suddenly felt heavy as lead. "What are you? What do you want with us?" The entity turned its hollow gaze toward her, and Matthias felt the air grow thick with pressure that made his ears pop. "I am the gardener of souls, the shepherd of the rooted flock. I tend the harvest that has been growing since the first blood was spilled upon this earth." Sergeant Vega and Private Kellner were chest-deep now, their arms moving in slow, graceful gestures, as if conducting some invisible orchestra. The reverse scripture flowing from their lips had become a beautiful counterpoint to the entity's words, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in Matthias's bones. "The war above is meaningless," the gardener continued, its branched crown swaying hypnotically. "Heaven and hell tear at each other like children fighting over toys, while the true work continues below. Every drop of spilled blood waters the seeds I have planted. Every prayer offered in desperation feeds the roots that bind this world together." Matthias felt his amulet finally burn through his skin, the silver tree of life now branded directly into his flesh. But instead of pain, he experienced a strange sense of completion, as if some essential part of himself had finally been revealed. The roots probing at his legs no longer felt invasive but welcoming, like the embrace of a long-lost parent. "You begin to understand," the gardener observed with something that might have been approval. "Faith and doubt are both forms of nourishment. The orthodox who fights for heaven and the heretic who serves hell are equally useful to my purposes. All paths lead down into the soil where truth takes root." Corporal Vasquez fired again, but this time her aim was not at the gardener, but at Sergeant Vega's head. The blessed bullet struck the buried soldier between the eyes, but instead of blood, dark sap flowed from the wound. Vega's chanting never faltered, and within moments, the bullet hole began to seal itself with new bark growth. "He cannot die," the gardener explained patiently. "None of my planted ones can die, for they have transcended the crude mortality of flesh and bone. They are becoming something greater, something eternal." Matthias was chest-deep now, his arms free but his rifle long since swallowed by the hungry earth. He could feel the roots threading through his internal organs, not destroying but transforming, preparing his body to serve as host for something that had never been human to begin with. "The war will end eventually," the gardener continued, its voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Heaven and hell will exhaust themselves in their pointless conflict, and when the dust settles, my garden will cover the earth. Every battlefield will bloom with my children. Every trench will become a nursery for new growth." Corporal Vasquez was waist-deep now, her rifle finally useless as the transformed earth claimed her arms. But unlike the others, her face showed no sign of the rapture that had overtaken her companions. Instead, Her expression was one of grim determination, the look of a soldier who had accepted death but refused to surrender. "You will not take me," she declared, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "I am Elena Vasquez, daughter of Maria, granddaughter of wise women who knew how to fight creatures like you." The gardener's hollow socket seemed to focus on her with new interest. "Tell me, daughter of wise women, what did your grandmother teach you about the planted ones?" Vasquez smiled, the expression terrible in its certainty. "She taught me that everything that grows can be burned." From somewhere within her gear, she produced a small glass vial filled with liquid that glowed with its own inner light. Holy oil, Matthias realized, but not the common blessed variety used in routine rituals. This was something older, something that predated Christianity itself, carrying the power of ancient faiths that had learned to fight things that should not exist. "Flame of Elijah," she whispered, raising the vial above her head. "Fire that burns the unclean." The gardener's branched crown began to rustle with what might have been concern. "Child, you do not understand what you risk. The fire that burns my garden will consume you as well." "Better to burn clean than to grow corrupt," Vasquez replied, and smashed the vial against her own forehead. The effect was immediate and devastating. Holy fire erupted from the shattered glass, spreading across her body in sheets of white-hot flame that somehow did not burn her flesh. Instead, the fire flowed down into the earth around her, following the network of black roots like a lit fuse racing toward its destination. The buried soldiers screamed in unison as the blessed fire reached them, but their voices were filled with gratitude rather than agony. The flames were liberating them, burning away the corruption that had taken root in their bodies and souls. One by one, they crumbled to ash, their twisted forms finally at peace. The gardener itself began to retreat toward the central oak, its movements no longer graceful but desperate. "You do not know what you have done." It called to Vasquez as the holy fire spread through its domain. The garden was a mercy, a place of eternal peace. Without it, they will know only death and decay. Corporal Vasquez was burning now, her body consumed by the same fire that was destroying the grove. But her voice remained strong, filled with the certainty of martyrdom. "Death is natural. Corruption is not. Let them rest as God intended." The flames reached the central oak, and the ancient tree began to burn from within. The gardener's form wavered like smoke, its carefully maintained physical presence dissolving as the holy fire consumed the roots that anchored it to the material world. Its final words echoed across the burning grove, a promise and a threat. "The seeds are already scattered. My work will continue in other soil, in other wars. This is only one garden among many." Then it was gone, leaving only ash and the sound of crackling flames. The red mud returned to its normal consistency, no longer hungry or alive, just ordinary earth stained with the blood of countless battles. The network of black roots withered and crumbled, their supernatural vitality extinguished by the cleansing fire. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Sergeant Vega, Private Kellner, and Corporal Vasquez were all dead, their bodies reduced to ash that mingled with the remains of the grove's other victims. Only Private Matthias survived, pulled free from the loosened earth as the supernatural forces binding it dissolved. He stood alone in the center of what had once been the gardener's domain, surrounded by the charred remains of trees and bones. The silver amulet had burned itself completely into his chest, leaving a permanent brand that would mark him for the rest of his life. The sensation of roots threading through his organs had faded, but he could still feel their ghost touch, a reminder of how close he had come to joining the grove's unholy congregation. The war would continue, he knew. Other battles would be fought in other places, and the blood spilled would nourish new seeds planted by the gardener's surviving essence. But for now, this particular horror had been cleansed, burned away by the sacrifice of a soldier who remembered older faiths and older fires. As Matthias began the long walk back to the Red Trench, he carried with him not just the memory of what he had witnessed, but the knowledge that some corruptions could only be fought with complete sacrifice. The war against Hell's legions was brutal and unforgiving, but the war against entities like the Gardener required something more: the willingness to burn away everything, including oneself, rather than allow the corruption to spread. Behind him, ash fell like snow over the ruined grove, covering the bones of the faithful and the damned alike. The red mud would return, fed by future battles and future bloodshed. But for now, the earth was clean, and the dead could finally rest. The silence that followed the grove's destruction was almost more unsettling than the reversed chanting had been. As Private Matthias trudged through the ash-covered remains of what had been the gardener's domain, he became aware of how thoroughly the entity's presence had permeated the local environment. The very air seemed lighter now, no longer thick with the oppressive weight of unnatural growth and spiritual corruption. But the silence also carried a quality of expectation, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would grow in the void left by the grove's destruction. The gardener's final words echoed in Matthias's mind. The seeds are already scattered. The implication was clear. This had been merely one manifestation of something much larger and more widespread. As he picked his way carefully through the cooling ashes, Matthias began to notice details that the supernatural influence had previously obscured. Scattered among the remains were fragments of military equipment from dozens of different units, representing not just the current war but conflicts stretching back centuries. Rusted mail that might have belonged to the original Crusaders lay beside modern rifle parts, while fragments of armor bearing the symbols of long-dead knightly orders were mixed with the personal effects of recent casualties. The grove had been feeding for a very long time, drawing victims from every army that had ever passed through this region. The gardener had not been lying when it claimed to predate the current conflict. It was something ancient that had learned to adapt to changing circumstances, finding new ways to harvest the faith and devotion of each generation's warriors. Matthias paused beside what remained of the central oak, now nothing more than a pile of ash, shaped vaguely like a tree. Even destroyed, it maintained a sense of presence, as if something essential still lurked within the charred remains. He could feel heat radiating from the ashes, not the natural warmth of recent fire, but something deeper and more persistent. Against his better judgment, he knelt and sifted through the ash with his bare hands. The material was finer than normal wood ash, with an almost powdery consistency that clung to his skin despite his efforts to brush it away. But buried beneath the surface, his fingers encountered something solid and smooth. It was a seed, perfectly black, and roughly the size of his thumb. The surface was hard as stone but warm to the touch, pulsing with a faint rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Even as he held it, Matthias could feel a subtle influence trying to work its way into his mind, whispering suggestions about fertile soil and patient cultivation. He should destroy it, he knew. Drop it and crush it beneath his boot, or better yet, find some of Corporal Vasquez's holy oil and burn it completely. But something stayed his hand, a curiosity that felt both natural and suspect. The seed represented knowledge, understanding of an enemy that the Orthodox forces barely comprehended. Surely it would be valuable for research purposes, a way to develop better defenses against similar entities. The rationalization felt hollow even as he made it, but Matthias found himself slipping the seed into his breast pocket anyway. The weight of it was comforting rather than threatening, a small warm presence that seemed to ease the ache in his branded chest where the silver amulet had burned itself into his flesh. The walk back to the Red Trench took longer than expected, partly because Matthias had to navigate around several new shell craters that had appeared during the patrol's absence, and partly because he found himself stopping frequently to rest. The encounter with the Grove had drained him more than he initially realized, leaving him weak and oddly hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of his core. The sun was setting by the time he reached the forward observation posts, painting the perpetual smoke clouds in shades of deep red and orange that reminded him uncomfortably of the transformed soil he had witnessed. The sentries challenged him with the day's password, their voices tight with the strain of maintaining alertness in an environment where threats could take any form. "Patrol returning," Matthias called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Sole survivor." The ladder down into the trench felt impossibly long, each rung slick with condensation that had taken on a reddish tint in the fading light. His boot squelched in the familiar mud of the trench floor, but now the sound seemed different, more organic somehow, as if the earth itself had developed a circulatory system. Chaplain Mordecai waited in the command bunker, his pale eyes reflecting the blessed candles as he studied the report Matthias delivered with mechanical precision. The words felt strange in his mouth, clinical descriptions of horrors that defied both military protocol and theological understanding. He spoke of the planted soldiers, the reverse scriptures, the entity that called itself the Gardener of Souls. But he said nothing about the seed. 3 casualties, the chaplain repeated, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar reports. Sergeant Vega, Corporal Vasquez, Private Kellner, all consumed by enemy action. Corporal Vasquez destroyed the Grove, Matthias emphasized, needing someone to understand her sacrifice. She burned it clean with holy fire, ancient fire. The entity was banished. Chaplain Mordecai nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested he found the report incomplete, as if he could sense the omission that gnawed at Matthias's conscience. The blessed amulets proved ineffective against this particular corruption. Matthias' hand moved instinctively to his chest, where the silver tree of life had burned itself permanently into his flesh. The branded skin was still tender, each breath causing the raised scar tissue to stretch and pull. The entity fed on our faith itself, sir. The blessed metal became a conduit for corruption rather than protection. Interesting. The chaplain's fingers drummed against the map table, a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulsing of the seed in Matthias's pocket. Command will need to adjust our consecration rituals accordingly. We cannot allow our own faith to become a weapon against us. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering tactical details and strategic implications that felt increasingly irrelevant. Matthias answered each question with the precision drilled into him by years of military service, but part of his mind remained focused on the warm weight pressing against his ribs. The seed seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of the choice he had made in the grove's ashes. When he was finally dismissed, Matthias made his way to his assigned bunk in the sleeping quarters carved deep beneath the trench floor. The other soldiers were already preparing for the night watch rotation, cleaning weapons and checking equipment with the methodical attention that kept men alive in an environment where carelessness meant death. But as he lay on his narrow cot, listening to the familiar sounds of military routine mixed with distant artillery fire, Matthias became aware that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with the war around him. The cause that had once filled him with righteous purpose now seemed abstract and distant, while the seed in his pocket felt immediate and vital. He dreamed that night of vast underground networks, root systems that stretched beneath entire continents, carrying messages between groves scattered across the world's battlefields. In his dream, he could understand the language the roots spoke, a form of communication that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the cells and tissues of the body. The network was ancient beyond human comprehension, predating not just the current war but the rise of humanity itself. It had watched species come and go, adapting its methods to harvest the spiritual energy released by each civilization's conflicts. The religious wars were particularly nourishing, feeding the network with the concentrated faith of millions of believers locked in mortal combat over theological abstractions. When Matthias woke before dawn, he found that his understanding of the grove's purpose had shifted during sleep. The gardener had not been lying when it spoke of mercy and eternal peace. The planted soldiers had achieved a form of immortality, their consciousness preserved within the network while their bodies served as anchors for something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. The seed in his pocket had grown warm during the night, warm enough that he could feel its heat through the fabric of his uniform. When he pressed his palm against it, images flashed through his mind, glimpses of other groves scattered across the front lines of the war. Most were smaller than the one he had helped destroy, but some were vast, covering acres of contested territory with their networks of planted faithful. The morning briefing brought news that made these visions feel prophetic rather than imaginary. Reports were coming in from multiple sectors of anomalous vegetation growth, areas where the characteristic red mud of no man's land was giving way to rich, dark soil that supported plant life, despite the chemical contamination from years of artillery bombardment. Botanical warfare, Chaplain Mordecai suggested, though his tone carried little conviction. The enemy may be introducing engineered organisms designed to alter the local ecosystem. But Matthias knew better. The network was expanding, establishing new nodes to replace the one Corporal Vasquez had destroyed. The gardener's essence had not been eliminated, merely dispersed, and it was already beginning the process of regrowth. The seeds it had scattered were taking root in soil fertilized by the blood of the faithful, drawing nourishment from the very violence that was meant to defend against corruption. Throughout that day and the days that followed, Matthias found himself volunteering for reconnaissance patrols and forward observation duties. Each mission took him closer to the areas where the anomalous growth was reported, allowing him to witness the network's expansion firsthand. The sight should have filled him with horror and determination to fight against the spreading corruption. Instead, he felt a growing sense of completion, as if he were finally approaching his true purpose in the grand design of the war. The seed in his pocket pulsed with increasing frequency, and he began to understand that it was not merely a remnant of the destroyed grove but a communication device. allowing him to maintain contact with the vast intelligence that had created it. The branded scar on his chest had begun to change as well, the simple outline of the tree of life becoming more complex and detailed with each passing day. New branches appeared in the silver-burned flesh, extending across his ribs and up toward his collarbone. The pattern was beautiful in its intricacy, resembling not just any tree but specifically an olive tree, with leaves and fruit rendered in raised scar tissue that was sensitive to the slightest touch. His fellow soldiers began to comment on the changes in his behavior, noting that he had become quieter and more introspective since returning from the grove. Some attributed it to survivor's guilt, the psychological trauma of watching his patrol mates die in such a horrific manner. Others suggested that he had been touched by some form of spiritual corruption and should be examined by the chaplain. But Chaplain Mordecai seemed content to let Matthias continue his duties without intervention, perhaps recognizing that the private's first-hand experience with the entity made him valuable for intelligence-gathering purposes. Or perhaps the chaplain had his own reasons for allowing the situation to develop, reasons that related to the broader struggle being waged on levels that ordinary soldiers could not comprehend. 3 weeks after the grove's destruction, Matthias was assigned to lead a patrol investigating reports of unusual root growth near the ruins of a village that had changed hands multiple times during the current offensive. The mission briefing mentioned previous patrols that had failed to return from the area, their fate unknown but presumed hostile. As his small team made their way through the blasted landscape toward their objective, Matthias could feel the seed in his pocket growing warm with anticipation. The scarred flesh of his chest tingled with sympathetic resonance, and he began to understand that this mission was not a military assignment but a homecoming. The village ruins were covered with vegetation that had no business growing in soil, poisoned by years of chemical warfare. Olive trees flourished among the collapsed buildings, their branches heavy with fruit that gleamed like polished silver in the perpetual twilight. The very air seemed different here, cleaner and more vibrant, carrying scents of growing things and rich earth. But it was the figures moving among the trees that made Matthias's companions reach for their weapons. At first glance, they appeared to be enemy soldiers, but closer inspection revealed the truth. These were the missing patrol members, their bodies showing the familiar signs of plantation, buried from the waist down in rich soil, while their upper bodies swayed gently in the breeze that rustled through the olive branches. Their eyes were closed, their faces serene, their lips moving in the reverse scripture that Matthias had learned to recognize. But unlike the tortured expressions he had witnessed in the original grove, these planted ones seemed genuinely at peace, as if they had found something they had been searching for their entire lives. "Mother of God," whispered one of the patrol members, a young soldier named Pietro who still carried the idealism of the newly enlisted. "What's happened to them?" Matthias felt the seed in his pocket pulse with warmth, and when he spoke, the words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind. "They've been saved, preserved, given eternal purpose in something greater than human understanding." His companions stared at him with expressions of growing alarm, hands tightening on rifle stocks as they began to perceive him as a potential threat rather than their patrol leader. But before any of them could react, the ground beneath their feet began to soften, the familiar red mud giving way to rich, welcoming soil that seemed eager to embrace them. "Don't fight it," Matthias advised, his voice carrying the authority of revelation. "There's no pain, no fear, only peace and purpose and the knowledge that your sacrifice will nourish something beautiful. The planted soldiers among the olive trees opened their eyes in unison, fixing their gaze on the struggling patrol members with expressions of infinite compassion. Their reverse scripture became a welcoming hymn, inviting the newcomers to join their eternal vigil in the garden that was slowly but inevitably consuming the world. Private Pietro sank to his knees as the soil reached his waist, his rifle forgotten as wonder replaced terror in his expression. "I can hear them," he whispered. "They're singing about roots and branches, about the deep connections that bind all living things together." One by one, the other patrol members succumbed to the garden's embrace, their bodies sinking into soil that transformed them even as it claimed them. Matthias watched with growing satisfaction as each new addition strengthened the network, adding their faith and devotion to the vast intelligence that pulsed beneath the earth. When he was alone among the newly planted soldiers, Matthias reached into his pocket and withdrew the seed that had been his constant companion since the grove's destruction. It had grown during the weeks he had carried it, evolving from a simple black sphere into something that resembled a human heart, complete with chambers and valves that pulsed with visible circulation. He knelt in the rich soil and pressed the seed heart into the earth, feeling it take root with an almost sexual intensity. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. His consciousness suddenly expanded to encompass the entire network that stretched beneath the world's battlefields. He could feel every planted soldier, every grove, every root system that carried messages across continents with the speed of thought. The war above was indeed meaningless, just as the gardener had claimed. Heaven and hell exhausted themselves in pointless conflict while the true work continued below, transforming the very foundations of reality through patient cultivation and infinite love. Each battle fed the network. Each spilled drop of blood nourished seeds that would bloom into something beyond human comprehension. Matthias felt the soil rising around his legs, warm and welcoming, preparing to complete his transformation into something eternal and beautiful. His chest burned as the branded tree of life began to sprout actual branches, breaking through his skin in a cascade of silver sap that tasted of olives and ancient wisdom. As consciousness faded and something larger took its place, his last human thought was a prayer of gratitude to Corporal Vasquez, whose sacrifice had inadvertently scattered the seeds that made this expansion possible. Her holy fire had not destroyed the garden, but dispersed it, allowing it to take root in a dozen new locations where it could grow beyond the reach of any single act of martyrdom. From deep beneath the earth, something vast and patient smiled with 10,000 mouths, feeling the network pulse with new life as another node came online. The war would continue for decades or centuries more, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Every battlefield was a nursery, every trench a furrow waiting to be planted. The faithful would serve faithfully, as they always had, never knowing that their devotion fed something far older and more patient than the gods they thought they were fighting to defend. In the end, all paths led down into the rich soil where truth took root and bloomed into something beautiful and terrible and eternal. Above ground, the war raged on, but below, in the deep places where root systems carried whispers older than humanity, the real victory had already been won.